My name is Varun Karnanandam from Iconic Mortgages. I have Gathya from Nava Wilson.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Of course.
So we are going to talk about a most popular topic,
Yep.
landlord and tenant issues. What are you seeing right now in terms of the landlord and tenant board? What is the current trend? What is the biggest challenges?
So I would say the two most sort of issues that people are facing right now is on the landlord side, unfortunately, just with the way mortgages are going, they can't afford their houses anymore. So they're selling these properties that have tenants in it. So they're trying to navigate selling properties while they're tenanted, which has its own challenges. And then the issue you will always have on the side of the tenants is just non-payment of rent. That is unfortunately always going to be an issue. There's just tenants that unfortunately can't afford or don't want to. Obviously, there's different reasons. But I would say right now in today's market, those are the two sort of biggest issues around rental properties.
That's an interesting topic because I heard from a couple of realtors, they put the offer in and they had to back off from the offer because the house is on the sale. And I'm actually helping a client right now. They are losing the landlord is losing the house, and they were getting all the letters, and the bailiff is showing up.
Oh, shit.
And the client called me and asked me, "What do I do?"
Oh no.
I'm like, nothing you can do.
Yeah.
So that's being said, that what other rights tenant has if the landlord is losing the property? Can the lender get them out of the property?
So when a property is under power sale and there's tenants in the property, the lender, basically has to step into the shoes of the landlord. So I actually have an exact file like
let's
this
talk
where
about
we have a lender and they're doing power of sale on a property. The property is tenanted. So I had wrote a letter to the tenant saying like, hey, listen, like this is what's going on. Your landlord has defaulted on the mortgage and my client is, taking steps to take over.
So you're representing the lender.
I'm representing the lender. But from a legal point of view, the tenant, so long as they're paying rent, they're allowed to stay there. So it's as if you bought a property that had a tenant in it. So you take over that role as landlord. So you are now responsible for repairs. You're now responsible to obviously collect rent from them. You are the landlord. So similar to selling a property as a landlord that has tenants in it, you have those same challenges. So, for example, these people, these tenants, they're 4 months into their 1-year term.
So the landlord took them in knowingly.
Yeah.
He's at default.
Yeah. So now my client, even if they want to sell the property, unless the tenant's going to leave voluntarily, they're stuck being a landlord for the next 8 months. And they're not here. They're not in the industry to be a landlord. They're in the industry to lend money. So now this money is tied up because these tenants, again, so long as they're paying rent, et cetera, have a right to stay there basically to the end into 2025.
So let's kind of step back and let's talk as a tenant.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the biggest issue. Like my client calling, they were panicking. They don't know where to go. They couldn't get hold of the landlord. The letters were coming to their house. The bailiff is showing up on that. And this is with a major bang. So as a lender, is there a privacy issue in terms of what they can disclose to the tenant, what's happening?
So the tenant has, you as a lender, like if you want to take over a property of the tenant, you have to let the tenant know what's going on.
So there's no privacy breach. The landlord cannot come after you.
No. So like you can, obviously I would suggest not telling them how much, et cetera, things like that. But you can tell the tenant, listen, your landlord is in breach of their, or in default, of their mortgage. So as a lender, we're taking our legal steps to sort of take over. But yeah, it is a big issue because the other problem is, unfortunately, as the tenant, you're caught in the middle. Like you're like, hey, I paid my rent. Like what's happening? So it is unfortunate for the tenant because they are stuck in the middle. But I will say, again, as a tenant, if you are paying rent, you have a right to stay there. So whether it's a property manager that shows up at your door or someone is not saying they're here on behalf of the lender, the only person who could remove you from a property is the sheriff. So unless the sheriff from the Ontario Superior Court is showing up at your door, you have no obligation to leave.
At what point the sheriff shows up?
The sheriff will only show up if the property is tenanted. Technically, the sheriff can't show up unless they're going to the landlord-tenant board, or the lender has gone to the court or the landlord-tenant board to get an order for eviction. But again, if the tenant's not doing anything wrong, a court wouldn't be ordering an order for eviction.
Evict them.
So even when you are applying on behalf of a lender for an order for eviction, the court will take into considerations things like, is there a tenant in the property? Because if there is a tenant, then you can't get vacant possession because the tenants have a right to be there. So yeah, and it's unfortunate that it happens in the industry a lot. Like, you have these, big scary guys showing up at your door on behalf of these property management companies saying like, listen, you have 24 hours to leave, 72 hours to leave. And unfortunately, if someone like that is showing up at your door, you're going to get scared.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're not going to know the difference. Like, is that a sheriff? Is that, a regular guy? Yeah.
So I think there's a big difference between the bailiff and the sheriff.
That's the problem. So, and people, like, in the moment, you don't know that. So especially if you have young kids, like, you don't want all of that taking place. So it's unfortunate that it does happen, but the only person who can remove you from a property is the sheriff.
And as a tenant, you are still protected.
Yes, you still have all your tenant rights that you have under the Residential Tenancies Act with a lender as your landlord.
So the lender has to respect the same rules as a landlord until this has been sorted out,
100%.
or unless they come to an agreement.
Yeah. So as long as the tenant does everything they need to do, unless you guys come to some mutual agreement that you're going to leave, you're allowed to stay there as if you were any other tenant.
So this also leads into another interesting topic: cash for keys.
My favorite.
Okay. So let's talk about it. First of all, is it legal?
It is.
Okay.
So
I hear sometimes I hear it's not legal. Like
no. So cash for keys is basically two parties coming to an agreement. So long as whatever you're agreeing to is not.
I think we went through it.
Yes, many times, unfortunately. But so long as both parties are on the same page, it is legal. Definitely, it's unfair sometimes from the point of view of either side. Like, sometimes you'll have tenants that are just asking for crazy amounts of money. Like, I've seen as high as $50,000, which is insane to me that someone can ask you for $50,000 to leave your own house. But that's beside the point. Because what happened was they had sold the property, and
they had to close.
And the way the market was going, because this is when the market was going up, they risked having to, like, so if they didn't close and the buyer went to go buy another property and say they paid another $100,000, they would have been responsible for that. Option. So sometimes you unfortunately have to do the math and say, okay, is it better for me to pay $50,000 to these people and have an end to everything,
or get sued by that,
or get sued and then have to deal with the tenant? You still have a tenant on the property and all of that. So sometimes, like, it just sucks, but you have to do what you have to do. So it is unfortunate sometimes for when you have, unfortunately, the desperate landlords. But if both parties can come to an agreement, then that's fine. It's legal. There's no issues with that.
So you've seen as big as 50,000.
I've seen as big as 50,000, and I've also seen some tenants that only need, like, moving costs. Like, it goes on both sides.
Is how reasonable they are.
Of course. That's why even every time a client calls me about this, and they'll ask me, like, oh, like, what do you think that we should offer them? I'm like, honestly, it depends on the person. It depends on the circumstances. Like, there's so many things to take into consideration. It depends on your relationship with them. Like, I can't tell you a magic number that's going to be like, this is the number that they're going to leave for. You just hope that, both parties are going to be reasonable.
But at the end of the day, a deal is when both parties win.
Of course. Yeah. I always say you have to get to a number where both parties are happy and not happy at the same time.
Yeah.
The only thing
that's a real deal.
For sure. The only thing I will stress is ensure that your paperwork is in order. You don't want to be in a situation where you have now given $10,000, $20,000, whatever the number is, and you have a date that you guys agree to, and then the date comes and your tenant's still there. So my suggestion would be, please ensure that you get your paperwork in order before any money is changing hands.
Got it. I think I'm seeing a lot of things, and we started the conversation with that as well. The landlord is having affordability issues. Yeah. And some of the landlords, they don't want to go through eviction or going through all those issues with the lenders. What can they do reasonably without a cash for keys to come to an agreement with the tenant to sell the property? Because they know they're going to be losing the property. They can forecast, I'm in trouble. I won't be able to keep the payment. And especially renewals are coming up, and variable rates has gone up.
Yeah.
Even if you're at a 2-year term or 5-year term at 2%, now you're going to renew at 5-6%.
Yeah.
So you're already on a negative cash flow, and everything has gone up. So they want to walk out. What can they do Or what are the options the landlord has?
So not many, to be very honest. The first one I always suggest, especially if the tenant's been there for a while and you're not going to lose anything by asking, is see if they want to buy the property. They're already there. Their stuff is there. You're going to save on some commission. See if they'll buy the property themselves. If not, then you have to, if your only option at that point is to sell, then you are selling a tenanted property, which I'm sure you guys all know it has its own issues. You're going to have issues with, staging. You're not going to be able to stage the property. You're not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to do little repairs. If it's better to paint before you sell, you're not going to be able to do any of those things. You're going to have limitations with showings because you can't just on a whim say, okay, you can come see the property. You have to give 24 hours notice. Open houses get difficult, all of that. So I know cash for keys sounds like it's unfair, which in some cases for sure it is. But again, sometimes you have to do the math and say, listen, is it worth me paying $5,000, $10,000 to get this person out willingly, right? Where everyone is friendly, they leave the house in good condition. I know when they're leaving. I have certainty about when they're leaving. And then I get to, then you spend another, say, $10,000 to fix the house, but your return might be greater when you eventually sell, right? So I always, I know it's hard to swallow as a concept to be like, oh, why do I have to pay money to someone to leave my house? But sometimes in the long run, it makes more sense. So if that really isn't an option that you can't do cash for keys, then you have to go through the normal process, which is you sell a property with tenants in it, you do showings 24 hours notice, and then you give your tenant once you have sold the property.
In today's environment, that could be very difficult. The number of inventories out there.
For sure.
You don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And this is not something you cannot really blame the tenants either. You have to be they sign up a lease knowing you're going to be a good landlord, and if you're in a financial trouble, they cannot really get the short end of the stick.
Of course, for sure. It's not their fault.
It's not their fault. Yeah. And I think sometimes asking for the cash for keys is actually they're not being difficult. They just need to find a way out to go and live their life and carry on their life well, because they have families as well, right?
For sure. I had a client, and the tenant had moved in 2017, a long time ago. So you can imagine that the rent that they're paying is significantly below the market rent. And the tenant, he recognizes that, but he's just like, I cannot afford the market rent right now. He's like, he was paying something like $2,100 for an entire house, something like that. And now for him to go find another house, it would be $32, which is a large jump for a person.
It's a significant jump.
So he was kind of being hesitant about leaving because he was just like, even if I go there, then the problem is he's like, if I go there after 1 month, I'm going to get kicked out because I won't be able to afford the rent.
Absolutely.
So he's just like, even if I can manage to find someone that's willing to take me, and, and because of the way tenancies are and the landlord-tenant board, like you were saying in your discussion with Single Key, people are doing a lot of background work before they take a tenant, right? So if you have such a high bar, which I think is a good thing, don't get me wrong, to even get a tenancy, and then if you can't even get that, then you're stuck. You have to stay wherever you are, which is why you have so many tenants where even if the property's sold, or even if you have a landlord saying, I need the property back for my own personal use, you're having such pushback from tenants because they just can't find a place that they can afford.
I think there's a lot of stigma out there, right? Everyone thinks the landlords are being greedy and the tenants are taking advantage of it. It's actually not. Everyone has their own situation.
For sure.
Not everyone is a bad tenant. Not everyone is a bad landlord. Mm-hmm. But the situations do change according to what everyone's life stage and lifestyle they are in, right?
For sure. The problem is, I think, and to what you were saying, everyone thinks landlords, everyone brushes landlords with the same stroke of, you're these big corporate greedy people that are making all this money, and the tenants are you're just they're here to make you money. And everyone thinks all landlords are just taking advantage of the system, and they know how to play the game, and they're just, taking advantage of these landlords. So you're right in that everyone, all tenants hate landlords and all landlords hate tenants.
But everyone has their own needs and a life to carry on.
For sure. And all it takes is one situation that you're in. If you have one bad tenant, that will throw you off for the rest of any tenancy that you have. So it is very circumstance based. obviously as a lawyer, I only get calls when something goes wrong. So if you were to ask me like what I think about tenants, I'm going to tell you that a lot of the tenants sound that they're not doing anything great, but people will call me when things are not going well. If things are going well, they don't need to call me, right? So I think that I would like to think at least the majority of tenants are good people and the majority of landlords are good people. You just unfortunately have that bad group that just everyone talks about.
And I can talk about my personal experience. I manage a lot of tenants.
We can talk about
it, but we only talk about when things go south.
For sure.
And it's not that often. And not all my tenants are bad tenants. They're great people.
Yeah.
But this is the stigma that goes out. A lot of investors, they get back off. I don't want to deal with the tenants because no one goes and say how great my tenants are.
Yeah. Like you're not calling me being like, hey, Gathya, my tenant paid rent on time. A+.
And the situation that we went through, should we talk about?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So I found a tenant.
A+ tenant.
A+ tenant on papers. Few weeks into the property, then I was getting like text messages late in the night. It didn't look very professional. And I happened to knock on the door. Someone else showed up, nothing similar to the tenant who signed up the lease. Long story short, I was going on a trip, driving long distance to Montreal. I got a call from Toronto Police. And your house is being used as a trapped house.
Yeah.
Came back, couldn't find the tenant. And couldn't get hold of the tenant. Knock on the door, someone else showed up. Need to get the cops involved. Then it's become a civil case, not a criminal case. Long story short, I need to lock the doors down and go through the whole eviction process. It's not fun.
Yeah.
But that happened not that many times. And pretty much I have many other tenants. They are being great. They are respectful. They take their property as their own home. They do the gardens better than what we would have done at the property. So there's a good people as well, right? But no one ever talks about that.
Of course. See, that's what I said. Like everyone only talks about the tenants that are doing shitty things, unfortunately. Like the newspaper articles, like they're all about bad tenants and bad landlords. They're not about, obviously no one's writing about good landlords or tenants. But I think overall, I think generally, as long as you are screening properly and you use those right tools, you can find a good tenant and make a good investment and be fine. Like I knock on wood, I knock on wood, please, after this video, I hope nothing happens. My tenants have all been great. So especially as someone that only hears about the bad stories, I was so nervous to become a landlord because I was like, I'm going to be that person that's going to have to go through the landlord-tenant board. I have to represent myself and do this, but knock on wood, like I've been fine so far. So I think that generally people are good tenants.
That's the whole purpose of having a conversation to make sure it's not scary as you think. Like you can still a lot of good people out there as long as you do the proper screening using the proper tools. So can you give like 3 advice to the landlords and tenants what they can do to protect themselves before they get into the contract? Not just for the landlords, for the tenants as well.
I'll start with tenants because, in fairness, one thing I would say to tenants is there is a lot of resources out there. Use them. There's a community legal aid, which is a government-funded legal aid service, which provides free and I would call it discounted legal services. With tenants, regardless of your income, they will provide services to you. So most of the time,
it's a free service?
Yeah, it's a free service. So most of the time it is income based, but if you are a tenant, they will provide services to you. The Landlord-Tenant Board provides something called Tenant Duty Counsel, which is the same thing. It's legal advice that's free for tenants. So what I would suggest is if you have a question, if you have signed a lease and it sounds like your landlord is saying something that's a little offside, reach out to these services because they're there for you. They're there to help you. So they kind of
review the contract before you sign it?
They'll tell, and even like sometimes even community legal aid, they'll represent you. So they'll write, I've had landlords, they'll come with me with letters from these community legal aid services because they're taking on these cases for landlords. So I would say as a tenant, there are many resources out there for you. So I would take advantage of those. The other thing I would say to tenants is, and this is something, again, if you go to these legal services, they will help you with this, is a lot of the things that landlords put in their leases, they don't mean anything. So you'll have these clauses that say, like I had a friend actually, and her lease said that if she had more than 2 visitors, she needed the landlord's consent, which is that's not a thing. So even if it's in the contract, it doesn't mean that it's enforceable. So that's one thing.
But why would they put it on a contract?
To be honest, from they're just to scare them, especially like if you have these students that like the worst sets of landlords, unfortunately, that I have seen are ones that rent to international students, because you have these students that are new to the country. They don't know what's really going on. They're scared. They don't have people here to help them. So you have these landlords that put these crazy rules in that say things like, you can't have guests, you can't do this, you can't do that. And they just, they're like, hey, I don't want any problems. And they just listen. But
because they don't have an option.
Yeah. And a lot of those things are not enforceable. Like you can't enforce things like a guest policy, like especially getting consent. That's ridiculous.
What are we paying a party?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Even I've had this, and I can see why landlords are concerned about this one. But you can have like a roommate. So what the rule is so long as you're not breaching municipal housing standards. So each city has every person needs a certain amount of like square footage to themselves. So long as you're not breaching those municipal housing standards, you can have other people in your house. So I get calls from landlords all the time. They're like, hey, my tenant, it's supposed to be one person, but like her boyfriend is here all the time. And unfortunately, that's fair.
Okay. You're gonna do much.
So as a tenant, same thing. Like on the tenant side, like you are allowed to have guests in your home. Again, so long as you're not breaching your municipal housing standards. So all of this is just to say, like, understand that not everything in your lease that your landlord is putting, because the landlords put in all these crazy clauses. Like I've seen all of these clauses. Not all of them are enforceable. So just like, it's like the most common is like a pet clause. If you can put no pets, but if they have a pet, you can't do nothing about it as a landlord. So things like that. For tenants, I would say for landlords, I would say as a landlord, you have to understand that you hold all the power until you give them those keys. So all the due diligence you need to do, you have to do it before they enter your home. Because once they enter your home, if something goes wrong, the eviction process is so much harder than if you sort of were proactive.
So don't
about
rush.
It. Yeah. Don't rush. Ask for, so long as the documents are reasonable and fair, ask for them. Use services out there. That's what professionals are here for. They're here to do these services for you. Use services like that, because for you to save on 1 month's rent because you don't want to use a professional, the cost in the end is going to be 3, 4, 5-fold. Yeah. So it just, as much as you can do before they enter your home, do that, because once they're there, not to say that obviously that's what the Landlord-Tenant Board is here for, and there's a process there, but it just becomes so much harder. So do as much due diligence as you can before a tenant sort of walks into your house. The other thing is like just maintain a good relationship. I remember I had a conversation with the realtor, and he said such a small thing, and I was like, it makes so much sense. He was saying how when he sells properties with tenants in it, he'll like buy them a gift card. He'll just be like, here's $100 gift card, so when we do our open house, you guys go have dinner. Like things like that. Just little things like that.
Appreciation.
Exactly. Just to keep because the relationship is so important. First of all, this person is in your home. That is a very important relationship that you have with them, right? So just as much as you can maintain good relationships with these people, just so when things happen, you have a foundation there already. If you are in a difficult situation, like you have to sell before the end of the term or something like that, like they'll be more willing to work with you when
they're more understanding.
Yeah,
and they know you're not doing
for sure. So that's why I would suggest, as much as you can, try to maintain good relationship. I'm not saying you don't have to be their best friend. Keep your distance as you choose, but just try to maintain. Them. Yeah. Have some form of a positive relationship with them, so you have that foundation already there. Would be my 2 pieces of advice for all landlords, because it will make the process so much easier. You will never think of your tenant until they become a bad tenant, and you don't want to have to think about your tenants. So that is my takeaway for.
I completely agree with you. Even when my tenants moves in, I tell them, you're my client. Yeah. At the end of the day, you have a purpose and I have a purpose. Mm-hmm. So let's respect each other. Yeah. Let's work through it. And if there's any challenges, let's talk it out. Let's be open about it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's it. Again, like this is a long-term relationship, at least a year.
At least a year.
Yeah. And like I said, this is it's your property. That's a very intimate place to be, right? So you would want them to treat it like it's their own home. You want them to take care of it, all of that. So, and that all is going to form from a good relationship.
And so how can a tenant screen the landlord with all this financial troubles? I don't know you have an answer or not, because I think that's a very important thing these days.
No, it is. And to be honest, I don't think there is a way for them. You can ask, but I don't see any landlords sort of agreeing. Some lenders will ask the tenant for, if it's an existing tenant and say a landlord is getting a new mortgage, some lenders will ask information from the tenant. So they'll ask them is the lease in good standing? How much are you paying, etc. So at least the tenant is aware that something is going on. But overall, it's hard for a tenant to sort of gather that information. But again, the point is that you don't really need that information, because so long as you're not doing anything wrong, remember, you have a right to stay there. So I don't think it's as important for a tenant to know what's going on with the landlord as it is for the landlord to know what's going on with the tenant in a financial sense, I mean.
Makes sense. What is rules and legislation around renting your own place? Like, for example, renting the basement apartment. So those tenancy rules are different than finding a tenant for your own property. So when you have someone living in your own property.
So the only place that it changes is if you are sharing a bathroom or a kitchen. So if you're sharing a bathroom or a kitchen, you don't fall under you're not technically bound by the landlord-tenant board. It's not a rooming house, but it's almost like a rooming house. So you're not, if you're renting something like your basement, where you have the complete upstairs and they have a basement, and in the basement they have their own kitchen, they have their own bathroom. It's as if you are renting a house.
It's two dwellings.
Yeah. That's fine. Where it gets complicated is if you say, for example, you're renting your house and you have one room, they have one room, but you only have one kitchen, one bathroom, then you are not bound by the landlord-tenant board. You're basically almost like a rooming house at that point. And then you are not governed by, if you have an issue with them, you don't go to landlord-tenant board. You are bound by the city bylaws and you have to go to court. It's a different process.
Oh, it's a completely, oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay,
because you have the other problem is you have to have a license to have a rooming house. So a lot of these places unfortunately don't. So they're in this limbo situation because you're not, because you're not under the landlord-tenant board, but you're not doing rooming houses.
Because you're violating.
Yeah. So it's a gray area. But if it is something like a basement, then it is as if you were renting the house down the street.
So what happens when you have two tenants on the lease, two friends sharing it could be a student rental or it could be even condo. Like I had a two.
Yep.
They couldn't get along, or one of them is in a bad financial and they want to break the lease.
Yep.
One of them want to keep it, one of them don't want to stay. So how do you handle a situation like that?
So a lease,
because they say we don't want to live together anymore, and they are having a disagreement and they want to leave.
So obviously in this situation, it's in the middle of the term. A lease is what we call joint and severable, which means that if you have more than one person, both people are responsible. But if one person's not paying, the other person's completely responsible. It's not your business.
It's like a mortgage.
Yeah, it's like a mortgage. It's not your problem if one person can pay and one person can't pay. If one person doesn't pay, the other person has to pay everything. They're both liable.
They're both equally liable.
Yeah, they're both equally liable. So between them, they can go sue each other if they want to. If one person has to pay the whole rent, but they are both liable to you. So regardless of what's going on in their own personal life, the rent is still due to you. Obviously, there's practical considerations of if you're going to get that money, that's a whole different issue. But from a legal point of view, they're both responsible. So if one person doesn't pay, you can technically turn around to the other person to get payment. But yeah.
So that's the same thing go with the student rental as well, when multiple friends are living together. So it's a good idea to put them all into the lease?
So most of the time, it depends on how you're splitting it up. So I've seen, for example, if you're taking one house and you're doing each room, normally what they'll do is each room has its own lease. So if you have one tenant not paying, then they're just not paying their portion of the lease and you can kick them out accordingly. Because the issue with renting out each room when you come to eviction gets complicated if you only have one lease, because if your lease just says 123 Queen Street, right? Yeah. But it's room A that's giving you problems. If all your leases 123 Queen Street, the landlord-tenant board won't grant you eviction, because what about everybody else? They're allowed to stay there, right? Okay. So when you
this is like individual leases.
Yeah. So that's why in a situation like that, if you're going to rent out each room, do individual leases, so that if you need to kick one person out, you're just kicking that one person out, because then everyone else is still okay. But yeah, as I would suggest, unless they're sharing, like it's one bedroom or, they're a couple or something, I would suggest an individual lease.
But that's also get tricky in terms of the financing. When the lenders see
Yeah.
multiple leases,
I can imagine.
is create a red flag is a rooming house. So especially if you're in the school area.
Yeah.
And if you're having a multiple leases, like if you're doing a refinance or if you're purchasing other property, they ask for the lease, you give them 5 lease. They'll be like, oh, especially if the subject property, they'll be like, what's going on? Like, this is a rooming house. So it can create a red tapes as well.
I can imagine. Do you find that it's mostly, like, if it's in the GTA only, they'll have an issue? Because, like, take a school like Waterloo or something. You still
it's
find
mostly
that...
because some areas are actually considered as a student rental. They don't even lend on it. Some lenders have restrictions, certain areas, certain condos. They don't even lend on it.
Damn.
Yeah, it's a lot of restrictions around there because they consider the areas as rooming houses.
And is the concern about the student ability to pay rent, or is it just
I think
it's too messy?
The lenders look at it as a little bit more risky in terms of maintenance and all the. I think the bylaw is created in such a way as well, so they consider it as a rooming house. And not all of the lenders, some lenders they step back and say, "This is not the area that we want to lend on it."
In fairness to student houses are so problematic. There's always issues, and young people are, and they're like
we've been there.
Yeah. It's just they cause a lot of problems. So I can believe why lenders
So
don't
if you
want to
are
lend.
owning a property in this kind of high density student area, what is a good advice? Take the lease under the parent's name.
Yeah, if you can get what I tell all my clients that rent to students, guarantor as a parent. At least one parent, they don't have to be a tenant on the lease. They have to be a guarantor. You can leave them as a guarantor, because chances are they're paying the rent anyway. So you might as well get a guarantor.
Someone is on the hook.
And it's a common request that landlords have. So I don't think that you would get pushback as a landlord if you made a request that the parent be on the lease. I've seen where when you're renting to more mature students. So for example, when I was in law school and I was renting, because we were a little bit older, we were law students, the landlord was okay with just us. But 100% when you're renting to undergraduate students, I would suggest getting at least one parent per child to be a guarantor on the lease.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Because to be honest, if they leave, they have no money. What are you going to go after their OSAP?
They don't have credit.
Yeah. So the only person you can go after is their parent anyway. So I would highly recommend getting one of the parents as a guarantor.
Absolutely. What are you seeing in the landlord and tenant world? What's the turnaround time right now?
So depending on where you are, for example, Toronto, I would say it's about 6 months, which is much better than it was before. So yeah, it's about 6 months. They are getting a lot better. They're doing they've I don't know if you've seen it, but they've done a whole revamp of their portal. So a lot of the things you can now do online, which you were doing before, mailing and emailing and going in person, all of that. So it is, yeah, I would say right now it's about 6 months, which is not too bad. But yeah.
You want to share any crazy stories?
There's so many.
Okay, give the best story.
This is the best story in the sense of it is all the pain that a landlord can feel was felt in the story. So I represented the landlord, and she was a first-time investor. She's not by any means is not a professional investor. She did the typical, immigrant thing. She refinanced her primary home to get money to buy this investment property. And her logic, she has 2 young kids, and she's like, I want to build for my family, which I respect. So she refinances her primary residence, buys this property in Brampton, rents to what at the time looks like a grandma and her 2 grandkids. And mind you, the grandkids are like maybe in their early 20s. So she rents the property to them. They pay first and last. Second month comes around, no rent. So she comes to see me and she's just like, hey, my tenants are not paying rent. And I'm like, have a conversation. That's always, especially if it's the first month.
Have a conversation.
Have a conversation, see what's going on. No response. she was reaching out to them, no responses. She tried to go by the house, no one's opening the door. So she comes back to me. She's like, listen, like I think we need to take legal steps. So I served them the N4 notice, which is the notice for non-payment of rent.
No response.
Yeah, no response. So I filed the application. I'm like, okay, we got to do what we got to do. I filed the application, and I get the hearing date. The hearing date, I filed the application in August. The hearing was in February, so about the 6-month mark. Hearing date. So I file all my evidence as I'm supposed to. Hearing date comes, and it's virtual. So I'm sitting in this room waiting to start, and they're checking everybody in, and someone all of a sudden they're like, hello, and then the person was like, yes, you're at the Landlord-Tenant board, like, how can we help you? What matter are you here for? And he's like, I'm here on behalf of the tenant and he says the property address, and I was like, oh my God. And he's like, the tenant can't make it because he might have COVID, so he's in the hospital. They're unable to make it. So then the adjudicator turns to me and she's like, hey, like, they're saying this, like, are you okay to adjourn? And I said, no, because I've already waited this long for a hearing, and like, no offense, even if they showed up today, like, what would they say?
Yeah.
They're like 8 months behind on their rent. They're not even trying to make payment. We're trying to work with them, nothing. So first adjournments they always allow. So they ended up adjourning.
You don't have a choice.
So I call my client to tell her this happened. And obviously she has no idea what's happening. So she picks up the phone, like thinking I'm going to give her good news. Like, listen, you have a termination date. And now I have to explain to her that some random person showed up and is saying that she's, they're not able to make it. And I'm sure they were lying 100%. Like, you're coming on the 11th hour telling me that they're sick. So fast forward, luckily my second hearing date was maybe like 2 months later.
It's not bad.
The joke is I had the same adjudicator. So the same lady that gave them the adjournment.
Extension, yeah.
So now it's the second day, and the tenant knows now too, like nothing is like, they're not going to be able to push it again. They didn't even show up. And so I told the adjudicator, and I said, I'm like, with respect, this is why I asked for the eviction, because I knew that they were not telling the truth.
They're just buying time.
Yeah, but to the point where the Landlord-Tenant board threshold is $35,000. This was over the threshold, so she's like, I can't even give you the full order. And I was like, do you see how messed up this is? That my client is now owed. It was $36,000. Rent was $3,000 a month.
So
it was 12 months. $36,000. Finally, we get this eviction. My client goes to gets the sheriff to go by the property to get, to evict them. All the appliances are gone. The house is trashed. So by the end of it, she spent what was supposed to be an investment property. She lost $50,000 on. You think that lady's ever going to rent again?
But this is the thing we want to highlight. I want to highlight it. Don't hear these stories, because this could have been mitigated by doing the proper due diligence at the front.
Every time I tell the story to an investor, that's what their response is. Like, no offense, whoever found that tenant did not do a good job.
Yeah. So it comes down to like, this could have been a different experience if you do your due diligence.
Yeah.
In the front.
If you use if
proper
you have resources, that's what they're there for. Like I said, spend the money. 1 month's rent in the long run is nothing for the amount of money it can save you.
There's a real estate agents, there's companies, you can do a due diligence, you can do your own research. You could have done a proper
1,000%.
job. And how did they find this tenant?
I believe through their realtor, unfortunately.
Okay.
But and again, she's a first-time investor, so I
understand.
I understand.
But the thing is, she's scarred for the rest of the life to even.
She sold the house almost immediately. She relisted as soon as she got.
Stress she dealt with.
She was like, "I'm done. I don't think she's ever gonna."
But not every tenant does that either, right? So we want to highlight it. Not every tenant.
Again, it is. I only hear the worst case.
Yeah.
So but I 1,000%. It doesn't have to end. It didn't have to be like that, but it is what it is. We're here.
This is off topic. Nothing to do with the landlord tenant boards. What are you seeing in the pre-construction world? I'm sure you do a lot of litigation. I have 3 clients.
Yeah.
One of them is actually had $400,000 less on the appraisal. We talked on the video with someone else. And I'm dealing one right now, bought a property for $1,840,000. Oh, wow. Appraisal came at $1,400,000. They are selling they're trying to sell 2 properties to come up with a shortfall. Thought they can get a mortgage from a bank. Now they're taking a private mortgage. They cannot walk away from the contract. So it's pretty tricky out there.
I would say in the last maybe month and a half, I've had maybe 4 or 5 new clients that are builder breaches. There's not as many, knock on wood, resale breaches.
Because it cannot be because you are within the market price, right? Yeah. So this we are still dealing with the peak prices.
For sure. And it's same, and it's crazy that you say that the 1.8 versus 1.4. Like the appraisals are so low. Like we're not even talking about maybe 100,000. You can figure it out, make it up, get a line of credit, like figure it out.
This is like way off.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they can't even sell the property because they want to close it because they don't want to get sued.
And even like they'll try to assign the property, but no one is buying for those prices anymore. Yeah. So either way, that difference, that shortfall is still like your problem. But yeah, it's very common, unfortunately. And the problem is, like you were saying, like these people signed these agreement purchase sales in like 2021 when the market was really hot, and everyone was doing this, and now they're because pre-cons take 2-3 years, especially with COVID. It's getting pushed even further, and
the condo especially downtown.
Yeah, but the prices are crazy. Like I had a client that breached on a condo. And the purchase price was like $740,000, and it was a 1+. And I was so mind boggled. I was like, that sounds like a lot of money for a 1+, but at the heat of the market, like that was the price.
That was
that's
a good price.
That's what people were buying for. So now, he's getting his appraisal, and his appraisal was like $600,000, like something like that. And I was like, that's insane. But it is unfortunately happening. Again, you're having all these new bills that are coming to closing now. So it is unfortunately going to be a common problem right now.
So how are you helping? Like what are the options for the clients?
So some builders are offering VTBs. So
I've seen that.
Yeah, if you can work, again, the problem with breaches, and I always explain this to my clients, is it's a numbers game. There's nothing legal about, in the sense of like, there's no liability issue that we're fighting. You have to see, does this make sense? Does the loss make sense? Does closing make sense? You have to run those numbers. So if the builder is offering a VTB and it makes sense, sometimes that's the best option. Sometimes going private is the best option. Sometimes it's not, though. Sometimes
it's better to walk away.
Yeah, it's better to walk away. Like we had a client where if he was going to go private, it was going to cost him like $9,000 a month interest only. And we're like, does that make sense? Like,
can you afford it?
Yeah. So you're going to...
If so, how long? And even if you buy it, how are you going to sell it?
Yeah. So sometimes like you just have to like look at the numbers and make a decision. But with breaches, it's unfortunate because again, there's very rarely a fight of liability. So it does come back down to the numbers. Some builders are good in that they understand, like, no one doesn't close because they don't want to. They're just like, no, I don't feel like closing. Obviously, there's a reason you're not closing. It's usually financial. So some builders will recognize that and try to work with you. So even if you don't close and they end up suing you, like they're open to payment plans if we can reach a settlement, things like that. But it is just a very unfortunate situation to be in. Like I feel for all my clients.
Yeah, which they are not purposely doing. It's not maliciously done.
For sure. That's I think something that's hard for buyers to it's a hard pill to swallow because they're like, it's not my fault. It's not my fault that I couldn't close. But at the end of the day,
but technically, legally, it's your fault.
It's a contract. You breached the contract. That's all it is. It is very unfortunate. And I've had matters where the judge is very sympathetic. The judges, they say like, I understand it's very difficult, but from a legal point of view, you breached a contract and that's all it is.
So what happened? Like, what's the best thing happen? Like in terms of working things out behind at the end of the litigation?
So depending on your financial situation, reaching a settlement is always the best option.
Are the builders settling in?
They are, because you know what it is? Builders are also here to make money. So I say this all the time. You can't take blood from a stone. If you don't have any money to pay, a builder can claim that you owe them $600,000. If you don't have $600 to give them, what are they going to do, right? So builders are also aware of that, and obviously their lawyers are advising them that as well. So they would rather get $200,000 of guaranteed funds or chase you for $600,000, right?
So they know you cannot get it.
Yeah, and if I had $600,000, I would have bought the house.
I would have closed it.
So a lot, like builders are aware of that. Again, they're here to make money, so they will, what they normally do, and this is very common now, is if you're going to make an offer to settle, you fill out like an asset liability form, so they understand where your money is coming, where it's going. So is this a real offer sort of that you're making? So like settlement is like in almost any situation, settlement is going to be the best option. It's obviously getting to a settlement that, again, everyone's happy and unhappy with.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you
and
so much.
Thank you for all the info and wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you want to learn more, if you want to reach out to Gathya, what's the best way to get hold of you, Gathya?
You can call us at the office, or you can send me an email. Either or is fine.
What is the email address?
Oh, it's that's a good point. It's Gathya@navawilson.law.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.